Some men can buy anything except the one thing that matters most. Alexander Drake learned this truth the hard way, standing alone in a penthouse worth $40 million, holding an ultrasound photo that would never belong to him. The image was blank, empty, a cruel reminder that all his wealth, all his power, all his ruthless ambition couldn't fill the void where his heart used to be. He was 38 years old, controlled an empire that spanned 3 continents, and yet he couldn't control the one thing he wanted more than his next billion: a child, an heir, someone to prove that beneath the cold exterior and calculated decisions, he was still human, still capable of creating something that mattered. But Alexander Drake didn't become a billionaire by dwelling on what he couldn't have. He became a billionaire by finding solutions, no matter how unconventional. And that's exactly what brought him to this moment. Standing at his office window 70 stories above Manhattan, waiting for a woman who would either give him everything he wanted or remind him why he stopped believing in people a long time ago. The city stretched out below him like a kingdom of glass and ambition, every building a testament to men who refused to accept no for an answer. He was one of them, the best of them. And today, he was about to make a transaction that would change his life forever, though not in the way he expected. What Alexander didn't know was that the woman walking into his building at that very moment was about to shatter every assumption he'd built his life upon. Evelyn Carter stepped to the revolving doors of Drake Tower with her heart hammering against her ribs and her hands clutching a worn folder that contained her entire future. She was 26 years old, a kindergarten teacher who made $32,000 a year, and she was about to meet a man who probably spent more than that on a single watch. The marble lobby stretched out before her like a cathedral to capitalism, all soaring ceilings and cold, perfect surfaces that seemed to whisper that she didn't belong here. She almost turned around, almost walked back out into the spring sunshine, and forgot this insane idea. But then she thought about her mother lying in that hospital bed, thought about the medical bills stacked on her kitchen table like a tower of impossible choices, thought about her little brother who never got the chance to have children of his own. And she kept walking. The surrogacy agency had called a miracle match. A billionaire looking for a surrogate. A young woman desperate enough to say yes. $500,000. Enough to save her mother's life, keep the family farm, and maybe, just maybe, stop feeling like she was drowning every single day. The agency assured her it would be simple, clinical, professional, in vitro fertilization. No contact necessary beyond medical appointments. She would carry his child, deliver it, and walk away with enough money to breathe again. It sounded too good to be true, which of course meant it probably was. But Evelyn Carter had learned a long time ago that sometimes you have to make impossible choices to survive. Sometimes you have to trust strangers because the people you love are dying. Sometimes you have to walk into a billionaire's office and offer him the most intimate gift one person can give another, even when you've never given that gift to anyone before. The elevator ride to the 70th floor felt like ascending to another world. Evelyn watched the numbers climb and wondered what kind of man pays $500,000 for a child. What kind of loneliness drives someone to seek out a stranger to build their family? She touched the silver locket at her throat, the one with her brother's initial engraved on the front, and whispered a small prayer. Please let this work. Please let this be the answer. The doors opened with a soft chime, and suddenly she was standing in a hallway that looked like it belonged in an art museum. A receptionist with perfect hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes directed her to the corner office. Mr. Drake was expecting her. Of course he was. Men like Alexander Drake didn't wait for anything. She knocked on the mahogany door, heard a voice like gravel and silk tell her to come in, and stepped into a room that stole her breath. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, like a painting of power itself. Dark hardwood floors gleamed under track lighting. And there, silhouetted against all that impossible light, stood a man who looked like he'd been carved from marble and taught to breathe. Alexander Drake turned to face her, and Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully rehearsed composure. This was a man who commanded boardrooms, who made grown men nervous with a glance, who'd probably never heard the word no and meant it. And yet, As he extended his hand to her, she saw something else flickering behind those calculating eyes. Loneliness. The same desperate, aching loneliness she saw in her own mirror every morning. "Mr. Drake," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for seeing me." His handshake was firm, warm, and over too quickly. He gestured to a leather chair that probably cost more than her car, and she sat, smoothing her simple navy dress over her knees. She could feel him studying her, cataloging every detail like she was a business proposal he was considering. She was used to being underestimated, used to being overlooked, but the way Alexander Drake looked at her made her feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and thrilling. "You must be Evelyn Carter," he said, and even the way he said her name felt intimate somehow. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, without her voice shaking. He leaned against his desk with a casual grace that seemed at odds with his corporate armor, and asked the question she'd been dreading. "Why?" Just one word, but it contained multitudes. "Why would you do this? Why would you carry a stranger's child? Why would you put yourself through something so profound for money?" Evelyn had practiced her answer a dozen times, refined it until it sounded professional and detached. But sitting in this office, looking into those gray eyes that held so much carefully hidden pain, she found herself telling him the truth instead. She told him about her brother, about the accident, about the children he would never have. She told him about her mother's cancer, about bills that kept coming even when hope had long since disappeared. She told him things she hadn't told anyone, and with each confession, she watched something in Alexander's expression soften. This was supposed to be a business transaction, a simple exchange of services for money. But somehow, in the space between her words and his silence, it was becoming something else entirely. When she admitted she was a virgin, she braced herself for shock, disgust, maybe even anger. Instead, Alexander Drake did something that would replay in her mind for days afterward. He knelt in front of her chair, took her trembling hand in his much larger one, and thanked her, not for the surrogacy, not for solving his problem. He thanked her for her bravery, for her sacrifice, for giving him a gift he'd waited his entire life to receive. And then, in a gesture so old-fashioned and unexpected it made her breath catch, he brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. It was the gentlest touch, barely a whisper of contact, but it sent electricity racing up her arm and made her heart forget how to beat properly. In that moment, with the most powerful man she'd ever met kneeling before her like she was something precious, Evelyn Carter realized she'd just made a terrible mistake. Not in coming here, not in agreeing to be his surrogate, but in thinking she could do this and walk away unchanged. What she didn't know was that Alexander was having the exact same realization. As he released her hand and stood, trying to regain the professional distance that had already shattered, he felt something crack in the armor he'd spent years building. This woman, with her quiet strength and devastating honesty, had just walked into his carefully controlled world and turned it upside down. He'd expected someone desperate, someone he could manage with money and contracts. Instead, he'd found someone who looked at him like he was a person, not a bank account. Someone whose vulnerability made him want to be gentle instead of ruthless. Someone who made him remember what it felt like to hope for something more than the next acquisition, the next victory, the next empty accomplishment. They finalized the details in hushed voices, both of them pretending this was still just business, both of them knowing everything had already changed. Alexander's lawyer would handle the contracts. The medical team would schedule appointments. She would receive the first payment immediately. Everything would be professional, clinical, exactly as the agency promised. Except they both knew it was a lie. The moment he'd kissed her hand, the moment she let herself be vulnerable, the moment they looked into each other's eyes and seen their own loneliness reflected back, they crossed a line that no contract could uncross. As Evelyn stood to leave, clutching her folder like a shield against feelings she didn't want to name, Alexander watched her and wondered if he just found salvation or set himself up for the kind of heartbreak he swore he'd never risk again. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a beginning and an ending all at once. Alexander stood alone in his corner office, surrounded by everything money could buy, and realized he'd just invited chaos into his ordered life. But for the first time in years, The emptiness felt a little less suffocating. The silence felt a little less permanent. And the future felt like it might actually hold something worth living for. Meanwhile, in the elevator descending 70 floors back to reality, Evelyn pressed her hand to her chest where her heart was still racing, touched her lips where she could almost feel the ghost of his kiss, and asked herself the question that would haunt both of them in the days to come. What happens when a transaction becomes something real? When a billionaire learns to feel again, and a woman who's given everything away discovers she might deserve something for herself. When two people who were supposed to stay strangers find themselves unable to forget the moment their worlds collided. The contract was signed. The money was transferred. The arrangement was set in motion. But neither of them could have predicted what would happen when clinical became personal, when professional became intimate, when a simple surrogacy became the most complicated thing either of them had ever done. Because sometimes the most dangerous deals aren't the ones that cost you money. Sometimes the most dangerous deals are the ones that cost you your heart. And Alexander Drake and Evelyn Carter were about to discover that some prices can't be calculated, some contracts can't protect you, and some feelings refuse to be controlled no matter how rich or powerful or careful you are. The question isn't whether they would fall for each other. The question is whether they'll survive what comes next. So tell me, have you ever made a choice that changed everything? Have you ever walked into a room and felt your entire future shift beneath your feet? Because that's exactly what just happened to two people who thought they had everything figured out. And trust me, they have no idea what's coming. 3 days after signing the contract, Evelyn Carter walked into Alexander Drake's penthouse with a single suitcase and the growing certainty that she just made a deal with the devil himself. But here's what nobody tells you about devils. Sometimes they look like salvation in a $1,000 suit, offering you everything you've ever needed, while asking for the one thing you never thought you'd give. The penthouse stretched out before her like a monument to excess, all marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city look small and conquerable. Alexander stood waiting in the foyer, and the way he looked at her, like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve, made her skin prickle with awareness. This was supposed to be simple, clinical, a medical procedure, a pregnancy, a transaction. But the moment she stepped across that threshold, both of them knew nothing about this would be simple at all. "Your wing is on the east side," Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral as he gestured down a hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity. "Complete privacy. You won't even know I'm here." It was a lie, and they both knew it. How could she not know he was there when she could feel his presence like electricity in the air, when every breath seemed to sync with his, when the space between them felt charged with all the things they weren't saying? But Evelyn nodded, thanked him with practiced politeness, and followed the housekeeper to rooms that were larger than her entire childhood home. She unpacked her modest belongings into a closet designed for a movie star's wardrobe, touched the silk sheets on a bed that could fit 4 people, and wondered what kind of loneliness drives a man to build walls as high around himself. What she didn't know was that Alexander was standing in his own wing, staring at the city lights, and asking himself the exact same question. The medical appointment was scheduled for the following week. One simple procedure. The doctor had assured them. In vitro fertilization. No physical contact required. Evelyn would be sedated, Alexander would provide his sample, and science would do what nature couldn't. It was all very modern, very sterile, very safe. Except nothing about any of this felt safe anymore. In the days leading up to the appointment, they existed in a strange dance of avoidance and accidental encounters. She'd find him in the kitchen at midnight, unable to sleep, making coffee with hands that shook just slightly. He'd catch her on the balcony at dawn, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the sunrise like it held answers she desperately needed. They'd exchange pleasantries, small talk that felt like a shield against the real conversation brewing beneath the surface. And every time their eyes met, every time their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same thing, the air between them crackled with possibility and danger in equal measure. But fate, it turns out, had other plans entirely. The morning of the procedure, Dr. Chen sat them both down in her pristine office and delivered news that would change everything. Evelyn's uterus, she explained with the gentle firmness of someone delivering a diagnosis, had a unique structure, a tilt, a curvature, something that made standard IVF not just difficult but potentially catastrophic. The risks were too high. Embryo implantation would likely fail, and if it somehow succeeded, the pregnancy could be dangerous for both mother and child. There was, however, another option: natural conception, the old-fashioned way, the only way that gave them a real chance of success. The silence that followed that revelation was so thick you could have cut it with a scalpel. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face, felt her carefully constructed walls of professional detachment crumble into dust. Alexander's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. This wasn't what either of them signed up for. This wasn't the safe, clinical transaction they both convinced themselves they could handle. "I'll void the contract," Alexander said, his voice rough. "You don't have to do this." And for just a moment, Evelyn almost said yes, almost took the escape he was offering. But then she thought about her mother's latest scan, about the cancer spreading faster than the doctors had predicted, about time running out while she hesitated. She thought about the $500,000 already sitting in her account, the first payment that had paid for surgery her mother wouldn't have survived without. And she realized with horrible clarity that she didn't have the luxury of saying no. Some choices aren't really choices at all. Some decisions are made by circumstance and desperation, and the crushing weight of loving someone more than you love yourself. So she looked Alexander Drake in his steel gray eyes and said the words that would bind them together in ways no contract ever could. "I'll do it." What happened next was a masterclass in human awkwardness and unexpected tenderness. They tried, at first, to keep it clinical. Scheduled appointments in Alexander's bedroom like they were business meetings. Dim lights and deliberate silence, and both of them too tense to do anything but fail spectacularly. The first attempt, Evelyn couldn't stop shaking. The second, Alexander couldn't go through with it, seeing the fear in her eyes. The third time, they both just sat on opposite sides of his massive bed and laughed at the absurdity of two adults who couldn't figure out something humans had been doing successfully for millennia. "This is insane," Evelyn whispered, and Alexander nodded, running his hands through his hair. "Completely insane," he agreed. And somehow, admitting the insanity of it all made it less terrifying. Somehow, laughing together their own inadequacy created a crack in the walls they both built so carefully. It finally happened on a night when neither of them planned it, which is usually how the most important moments in life occur. Evelyn had received a call from the hospital. Her mother's latest treatment wasn't working. They needed to try something more aggressive, more expensive, more desperate. She'd broken down in the kitchen, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, and Alexander found her there at 2 a.m, curled up on the cold marble floor like a broken thing. He didn't say anything, didn't offer empty platitudes or false hope. He just sat down beside her, pulled her into his arms, and let her cry until she had nothing left. And when she finally looked up at him with swollen eyes and a tear-stained face, when he brushed her hair back with gentleness that made her heart ache, something shifted between them. The kiss was inevitable. Soft at first, tentative, like they were both afraid of what it meant. But then it deepened, became urgent, became real in a way that terrified them both. They made it to his bedroom without breaking apart, and for the first time since this whole arrangement began, it wasn't clinical or awkward or forced. It was intimate, meaningful, two lonely people finding comfort in each other's brokenness. And when it was over, when they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like expensive cologne and her cheap shampoo, neither of them could pretend anymore that this was just a transaction. The pregnancy test came back positive 2 weeks later. Evelyn sat on the bathroom floor of her wing, staring at those 2 pink lines, and felt her entire world tilt on its axis. She was carrying Alexander Drake's child, a baby created not in some sterile laboratory, but in a moment of genuine connection, genuine feeling, genuine intimacy. She should have been happy. This was the goal, after all. This was what she'd agreed to, what she was being paid $500,000 to do. But all she could think about was the way Alexander had held her that night, the way he'd whispered her name like a prayer, the way he'd looked at her in the morning light like she was something precious instead of something purchased. She was falling for him. God help her. She was falling for a man who'd hired her to carry his child and walk away. How do you walk away from someone who's seen you at your most vulnerable? How do you hand over a baby and pretend your heart isn't being ripped out with it? Alexander's reaction to the news was everything and nothing she expected. He pulled her into his arms, spun her around his office like they were in some romantic movie, and for a brief, shining moment, she let herself believe this could be real. That maybe he felt it too. That maybe this connection wasn't one-sided. But then his phone rang. Reality came crashing back, and she saw the walls slam back into place behind his eyes. The business took over. Contracts to review, announcements to plan, logistics to arrange. She was pregnant with his child, but she was still the surrogate, still the employee, still the transaction. No matter how much tenderness had passed between them in the dark, the next weeks were a study in contradiction. In private, behind closed doors, Alexander was attentive, gentle, almost loving. He'd make her breakfast, rub her feet when they swelled, read parenting books late into the night. But in public, at business dinners and charity galas where he started bringing her as his companion, he kept that careful distance, never holding her hand too long, never letting his gaze linger, never giving the world any indication that she was more than what the contract said she was. And then came the charity gala that changed everything. Alexander had insisted she attend, had sent a designer dress to her room, had looked at her like she'd stolen his breath when she walked down the stairs in midnight blue silk that made her small baby bump visible for the first time. The event was everything she'd imagined high society would be. Champagne and diamonds and people who spent more on a single earring than she made in a year. She felt out of place, like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. But then Alexander's hand found the small of her back, warm and possessive, and suddenly she felt like she belonged. Like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They danced, and his hands played across her stomach where her child grew. And when he pulled her close and whispered, "You're the most beautiful woman here," she made a fatal mistake. She believed him. She let herself imagine that this was real, that she wasn't just a vessel for his air, but someone he actually wanted, someone he might actually love. The kiss happened in a shadowed alcove, away from prying eyes and camera flashes. It was desperate and hungry and full of all the things they weren't saying out loud. And in that moment, as Alexander Drake kissed her like she was oxygen, and he was drowning, Evelyn Carter let herself fall completely. But what neither of them knew was that someone was watching. Someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Victoria Sinclair, Alexander's ex-fiancée, stood in the crowd with champagne flute and a smile that promised nothing good. She'd seen the kiss. Seen the way Alexander looked at his surrogate, like she was his entire world. And she knew exactly how to use that information to destroy them both. Because here's the thing about fairy tales nobody tells you. For every prince, there's a villain waiting in the shadows. For every happily ever after, there's someone who wants to burn it all down. And Victoria Sinclair had spent 3 years waiting for the perfect moment to make Alexander Drake pay for choosing his pride over her love. The threat came in the form of a phone call 3 days later. Alexander's board of directors had questions. The media had questions. Everyone wanted to know why the city's most eligible bachelor was suddenly parading around with a pregnant woman young enough to be scandalous. Was this a relationship? A baby-buying scheme? Something that could damage the company's pristine reputation? And Alexander, faced with protecting his empire or protecting Evelyn, made the choice that would shatter everything they'd built. He went on television and lied, told a reporter that Evelyn was just a surrogate, nothing more, that there was no relationship, no feelings, no connection beyond a professional arrangement. Evelyn watched the interview from her room, watched the man who'd held her so tenderly reduce what they'd shared to a business transaction, and felt something inside her break. She'd known this would happen, known that men like Alexander Drake don't choose women like her when it really matters. But knowing it and experiencing it are two completely different kinds of pain. So here's the question that will determine everything that comes next. When does protection become betrayal? When does keeping someone safe become the very thing that destroys them? And can two people who shared everything find their way back to each other after trust has been shattered? Because the story isn't over. In fact, it's about to get much, much worse. Have you ever wondered what it takes to truly lose someone you love? Not through death or distance, but through your own cowardice? Alexander Drake was about to find out. 3 days after his television interview, 3 days after he'd reduced a woman carrying his child to nothing more than a hired womb, he stood in his empty penthouse and realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Evelyn was gone. Not physically, not yet. She was still in her wing of the apartment, still carrying his baby, still bound by the contract they'd signed. But she was gone in all the ways that mattered. She didn't look at him anymore, didn't speak unless spoken to, moved through his home like a ghost, haunting the scene of her own heartbreak. And Alexander, who'd spent his entire adult life controlling every variable, manipulating every outcome, found himself powerless against the one thing money couldn't fix. He'd broken her trust. And trust, once shattered, doesn't come back just because you want it to. But here's what Alexander didn't know. While he was drowning in regret and expensive whiskey, Victoria Sinclair was putting the final pieces of her revenge into motion. She'd waited 3 years for this moment. 3 years since Alexander had chosen his wounded pride over their relationship. 3 years since she'd made her own terrible choices that destroyed what they had. And now, seeing him fall for someone else, seeing him open his heart to a woman Victoria considered beneath them both, she wanted to burn it all to the ground. The media leak was surgical, precise, devastating. Anonymous sources revealed details about the surrogacy arrangement, Evelyn's virginity before the contract, the transition from clinical to intimate, the age gap, the power imbalance. Suddenly, every news outlet in New York was running stories about the billionaire who'd allegedly exploited a desperate young woman. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Investors started asking questions. And public opinion, that fickle beast Alexander had always managed control, turned against him with vicious speed. Evelyn saw the headlines from her bedroom, watched her private pain become public spectacle, and made a decision that surprised even herself. She was done hiding, done letting powerful people make choices about her life, done being a victim in someone else's story. When reporters camped outside Drake Tower, when they shouted questions about whether she'd been coerced or manipulated or paid to do something unethical, she didn't run. She stood in front of those cameras with her hand on her growing belly and told them the truth. Yes, she'd agreed to be a surrogate. Yes, she needed the money desperately. But no one had forced her, no one had manipulated her, and her choices were her own. The fact that she'd fallen in love with the father of her child, that was nobody's business but theirs. The reporters ate it up, of course. The innocent surrogate in love with the cold billionaire. It was a story made for headlines. But what they didn't see, what the cameras couldn't capture, was the way Alexander watched that interview from his office, the way his hands trembled as she defended him even after he betrayed her, the way something fundamental shifted in his chest. That night, he went to her wing for the first time since the scandal broke. She was sitting on her bed, surrounded by baby books and half-packed suitcases, and she looked up at her with eyes that held no hope, no expectation, just a bone-deep exhaustion. "I'm moving to the medical facility tomorrow," she said quietly. "It's better this way. For both of us. For the baby." And Alexander, who'd rehearsed a dozen speeches, who'd prepared logical arguments and emotional appeals, found himself doing something he hadn't done since he was a child. He begged. "Don't go," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Please, Evelyn. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't undo. But don't go." She looked at him for a long moment, this powerful man on the verge of tears, and asked the only question that mattered. "Why should I stay, Alexander? So you can deny me again the next time things get difficult? So I can watch you choose your empire over me every single time?" He had no good answer, no justification. So instead, he told her the truth. He told her about Victoria, about the engagement that ended in betrayal, about the baby she'd aborted without telling him, using his money to do it, then leaving him for his business rival. He told her about the walls he'd built, the ways he'd taught himself to see people as transactions, because transactions couldn't destroy you the way love could. He told her that meeting her had cracked those walls, and falling for her had shattered them completely. And the thought of losing her and her child terrified him more than any business deal ever had. "I was a coward," he admitted, kneeling beside her bed like he'd done that first day in his office. "I thought I was protecting you by keeping distance. Thought if I denied what we had, Victoria couldn't use it against you. But all I did was prove I'm still that broken man who chooses safety over love. And I'm so sorry." Evelyn listened, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly where their daughter kicked and turned. She wanted to forgive him. God, how she wanted to believe that love could be enough. But she'd spent her whole life putting other people's needs before her own. And for once, she needed to choose herself first. "I need to know something," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "If you had to choose right now between your company and me, what would you pick?" It was a test, and they both knew it. An impossible question with only one right answer. Alexander stood, pulled out his phone, and did something that would either save them or destroy everything he'd built. He called an emergency press conference. Right then, right there, and an hour later, he stood in front of every major news outlet in New York with Evelyn beside him, his hand firmly holding hers, and told the truth. He loved her, not because she was carrying his child, but because she taught him how to be human again. The surrogacy arrangement had been legal, consensual, and yes, it had become complicated when they'd fallen for each other. But that wasn't scandalous. That was just life, messy and unpredictable and beautiful in its imperfection. He didn't care what the board thought, didn't care about public opinion or stock prices or his pristine reputation. He cared about the woman standing next to him and the family they were building together. And if that cost him his empire, then the empire wasn't worth having. The room exploded with questions, camera flashes, shouted demands for more details. But Alexander only looked at Evelyn, searching her face for some sign that he hadn't lost her forever. She was crying, but she was also smiling, and her hand squeezed so tightly he thought his bones might break. "You absolute idiot," she whispered, and kissed him in front of the entire world. The scandal didn't disappear overnight. The board tried to force him out, but enough shareholders believed his vision to keep him in control. Victoria's involvement in the media leaks came to light, and she faded back into whatever hole she crawled out of, her revenge incomplete. Some investors pulled out, but others, the ones who mattered, stayed. And slowly, painfully, Alexander and Evelyn began rebuilding what had been broken. Trust doesn't heal quickly. Love isn't a magic cure for hurt and betrayal, but it's a start. And every day, Alexander proved he meant what he'd said. Every decision, he chose her. Every moment, he chose them. The pregnancy complications came at 7 months. Evelyn's blood pressure spiked dangerously high. The doctors ordered complete bed rest, warned that early delivery might be necessary. Alexander moved his entire office into her medical suite, worked from a laptop by her bedside, held her hand through every contraction, every test, every terrifying moment when they thought they might lose everything. And when their daughter decided to make her entrance 6 weeks early, tiny and perfect, and screaming with the indignation of someone who'd inherited her father's stubborn will, Alexander cut the cord with shaking hands and cried like he'd never cried in his life. Evelyn held their daughter, this impossibly small person they created together, and realized that some journeys take you exactly where you were always meant to be, even if the path there nearly destroys you. The proposal came 3 weeks later, in the hospital room, where Evelyn was still recovering and their daughter was learning how to breathe on her own. No grand gesture, no expensive ring. Just Alexander sitting on the edge of her bed at 3 a.m, both of them exhausted and terrified, and more in love than either thought possible. "Marry me," he said, "not because of the baby, not because of the scandal or the contract or anything else. Marry me because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you make me want to be better than I am. Because I love you more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." Evelyn looked at him. This man who'd started as a transaction and become her entire world, and said yes. Of course she said yes. Some love stories start with convenience and end with forever. Some fairy tales begin with contracts and end with vows. Some people find their home in the last place they ever expected to look. 6 months later, they stood in front of a small gathering at her family's farm upstate. No media circus, no society columns, just the people who mattered most. Alexander wore jeans and looked more relaxed than anyone had ever seen him. Evelyn wore a simple white dress and held their daughter on her hip. both of them radiating happiness, so bright it hurt to look at. The vows they wrote themselves weren't about promises of perfection or pledges of undying devotion. They were honest, raw, real. Promises to choose each other even when it was hard. To communicate even when silence felt safer. To build a life based on trust and respect and the kind of love that survives mistakes and misunderstandings. To be partners, equals, friends as well as lovers. When Alexander slipped the ring on her finger, when she kissed him while their daughter grabbed fistfuls of his hair, when their families cheered and the sun set over the fields where Evelyn had grown up dreaming of escape, it felt like an ending. But really it was just the beginning. Because here's the truth about love that all the romance novels get wrong. It's not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about choosing someone every single day, even when they frustrate you, even when life gets hard, even when the fairy tale feeling fades, and you're left with just the work of building something real. Alexander and Evelyn learned that the hard way. They stumbled, they fell, they hurt each other and themselves. But they also got back up. They also forgave. They also chose to believe that broken people can heal each other if they're brave enough to try. Their story isn't perfect. Nothing about it was easy or simple or predictable, but it's theirs. And in the end, that's all that really matters. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between what's safe and what's real? Have you ever loved someone enough to risk everything, even when the odds were against you? Have you ever been broken and found someone who helped you heal? Drop your story in the comments below. Tell me about the time you took a leap of faith, the moment you chose love over fear, the person who changed your entire world. And if this story touched you, if it made you feel something real, hit that like button and subscribe because we're just getting started. There are more stories to tell, more hearts to explore, more proof that even in our darkest moments, hope is always possible. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's struggling to trust again. Someone who's wondering if they deserve love. Someone who needs to be reminded that the best things in life are worth fighting for. This is more than just a story. It's a reminder that we're all capable of change, of growth, of becoming better than we were yesterday. That love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone worth the imperfection. So what are you waiting for? Your story matters. Your voice matters. Let's build a community of people who believe in second chances and hard-won happiness. Drop that comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story. Because trust me, we're just getting started.